Welcome, everyone, to a webinar sponsored by the National Adult Protective Services Association, NAPSA, and the APS Technical Assistance Resource Center. The topic is Supported Decision-Making, Guardianship, and APS. What's choice got to do with it? I am Alan Lawitz. I'm the Director of the Bureau of Adult Services for the New York State Office of Children and Family Services. I am also a co-regional representative for NAPSA Northeast Region 2. Thank you for joining us today. I want to note a few technical details. All attendees will be on mute. You can ask questions by entering them into the question box located on your webinar panel. Please enter questions into the question box rather than the chat box. This presentation is being recorded and attendees will be notified by email when the presentation has been posted online. The PowerPoint will also be posted online. After the presentations, our presenters will respond to as many of your questions as we have time for. I want to now introduce to you Andy Capehart. Andy is a senior business analyst and subject matter expert for WRMA, a consultant for the U.S. Administration for Community Living. Many of us also know Andy as the former assistant director of NAPSA. Andy, welcome.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate the intro. And as Alan already said, this webinar is a collaborative joint effort between the APS Technical Assistance Resource Center here at WRMA and the National Adult Protective Services Association and the National Resource Center for Supported Decision-Making. Just a note about the APS Technical Assistance Resource Center. We're here to support you in any of the work that you do. If you have any challenging issues you're wrestling with, we're happy to assist you. We'll have our contact information up on the screen, I believe, on the next slide. And if you'd like to reach out to us at any time with any sort of adult protective services issue, you can do that. You've got the web address right there so you can read more about us. And then also the email address to contact us if you have anything that we can help you with at all. And we're so pleased to have our speakers today and proud to be a part of this webinar. Thanks so much. Alan, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Those of us in the field of APS and those in related fields know well that APS has a unique responsibility to protect the safety of the vulnerable adult and to also protect the right of the adult to self-determination. This is a guiding value in the NAPSA Code of Ethics. This is a value set out in APS training and in law in most, if not all, jurisdictions. The NAPSA Code of Ethics for APS workers also calls for a focus on case planning that maximizes the vulnerable adult's independence and choice to the extent possible based on the adult's capacity. I work in New York State. In New York, as in many other jurisdictions, before an involuntary intervention such as a guardianship can be imposed by a court for a person believed to lack capacity in facing danger, the primary guardianship statute, as well as the enabling statute for APS in New York, requires a showing of why a less restrictive alternative and the use of other available resources would not protect the individual. That same guardianship law is also intended to result in a tailored guardianship if guardianship is found to be needed, a guardianship with powers individualized to the specific needs of the alleged incapacitated person who was before the court. We know that's the intent of the law. We also know that it doesn't always happen that way. Recently, there has been increasing interest within APS and related fields in exploring alternatives to guardianship where appropriate, and practices to help individuals with disabilities to live with a greater degree of independence while providing needed safety assistance. That's why today's presentation is so timely and important. Our presenters are nationally known experts in the field of supported decision-making, and I'm so glad that they have agreed to participate today. First, we will hear from Jonathan Martinis. Jonathan is the Senior Director for Law and Policy for the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. He has over 20 years' experience representing people with disabilities to protect their legal and human rights, including precedent-setting cases securing access to critical community-based services. In 2013, Jonathan represented Margaret Jenny Hatch in the Justice for Jenny case. the first trial to hold that a person has the right to use supported decision-making to make her own life choices instead of being subjected to a permanent plenary guardianship. Since then, Jonathan has spoken to and trained thousands of people across the country about the right to make choices and direct one's own life. Next, we will hear from Anita Raymond. Anita has a bachelor's and master's degree in social work. She has been immersed in guardianship and self-determination issues for 30 years. Anita is program manager of the Center for Excellence in Supported Decision-Making and Care Management and Consultation programs at Volunteers of America, Minnesota. She's also the co-convener of the Minnesota Working Interdisciplinary Network of Guardian Stakeholders, as well as executive board director of the Minnesota Association of Guardianship and Conservatorship. Anita has received numerous awards and recognition for her tireless commitment to quality of life for vulnerable adults. I've had the pleasure of hearing both Jonathan and Anita speak before, and I can assure you that you're in for a very informative time. So let's begin with Jonathan Martinis. Jonathan, welcome.
Good afternoon, Alan. Thank you, and thank you, everyone. I am going to make sure I have the technical skill to make sure this is up. So let's make sure. Does everyone now see my screen, which has my cover slide on it, supported decision-making, maximizing self-determination? Do you also, I appear to have a dialogue box on the right side. Are you able to see that? Should I minimize that?
I see it, Jonathan.
Okay, I am going to cut that. I can't believe it. I have no way to minimize that. So we're just going to move forward.
Actually, yeah, no, Jonathan, we can't see that, so don't worry about it. The viewers can't see that part.
Great. So fantastic. With that out of the way, thank you, Alan. Thank you, everyone. My name is Jonathan Martinis, and I am really honored to be part of this webinar. As someone who, as I think everyone on this call would characterize him or herself as, works with vulnerable populations daily, it is really not only a relief, but it is a happy thought that there are dedicated people out there who are spending their professional careers and probably a good deal of their personal time thinking about ways to make sure that people are safe. There are a lot of bad situations out there, and I, for one, in all the years I've worked in this field, have always been proud to know that APS is there when needed, and we hope that they are not needed, but when they are, they can both protect rights and, like Alan said, ensure self-determinations. And that's what today is going to be about. We're going to be talking about ways that you can do exactly what it is that you got in this field to do, to make people's lives better, safer, and stronger. And we're talking about a thing called supported decision-making today. I'm going to talk to you about the why of supported decision-making, the background for it, why it's a good thing to do. Anita is going to talk about specific practical ways to implement it, or the how of supported decision-making. Certainly, if you've heard of supported decision-making, you've probably heard about it as an alternative to guardianship, something that can be done instead of a guardianship. And while that is true, I always tell every audience I talk to two things. First, even though that's true, you will never hear me say today or ever that no one should be under a guardianship. Of course, there are times guardianship is appropriate. Second, everything that I tell you today is backed up by one of two things, law or science. The things that we are talked about today have been the subject of study for a very long time, and that is why we should be looking at them to do the exact things we got into this field for. So let's begin. I want you to think for a moment why I can't advance my screen. I've got a lockup. There it is. Think for a moment about rights. Alan said that rights are important, protecting rights and self-determination. So think about how rights are important to you, your favorite rights, the ones that make you feel the strongest about your citizenship and the things that you do every day. Things like freedom of speech and elections, freedom of association, of those bedrock rights that make us Americans, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And ask yourself what they all have in common. Every single right we have has choice in common. Freedom of speech is the right to choose what to say. Elections are the right to choose who will govern us. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is the right to choose what we do, who we do it with, and where we go in our lives. Up on your screen is a great quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, who said, "I am my choices. We are all the people we are because of the choices we have made. And I mean all of our choices. Good ones, bad ones, silly ones, significant ones. They make up who we are. And Alan used a phrase called self-determination. And when I hear that phrase, I just think making choices. The right to make choices, the bedrock right we have, that is self-determination. When people make more choices, when they have more control over their lives, they have more self-determination. So people who are self-determined do things instead of having things done to them. They make choices instead of being told what to do. And what we know from 40 plus years of studies is that when older adults and people with disabilities have more self-determination, when they make more choices, we know demonstratively and through study after study, they have better lives. Exercising our right to make choices leads to a better life. When people with disabilities and older adults have more self-determination, we have study after study that has found, like it says on your screen, they're happier, healthier, more independent, more likely to be employed, and safer. So ask yourself this, those rights, the ones that are most important to you, that make you who you are, would they be worth anything if you weren't allowed to exercise them? If you had the right to free speech, but you could only speak when someone lets you speak and only say what someone told you to say. If you could have the right to vote, but someone could tell you exactly who you must vote for, would those be rights? They wouldn't be, would you? If you had rights, theoretically, but had no choice, would they even be rights? Would the things that make us American be the things that make us American if we had no choices? And yet that's exactly what we've done for actually 1,500 years. The slide on your screen is a bit of a misnomer. I had to do some more research. For 1,500 years. You know, the very first time we wrote the laws down in the Western world, in ancient Rome, an emperor named Justinian got all the laws together and put them together in a book for the first time. In the Eastern world, they did that thousands of years before. But in the Western world, the Justinian Code was the first time they brought all the laws together in one place. You know what was in there? There was a law that specifically said if you are feeble-minded, their words, you had to have a curator put over you. And from that point, 1,500 years forward, we've had a culture in our society that says that when you have limitations, you can't do things, or that someone must be appointed to do things for you. Great Britain, where we got most of our laws from, they updated the Justinian Code and said, if you are an idiot or a lunatic, again, their words, you had to have a committee put over you to make decisions for you. And we have followed that pattern ever since. We call that guardianship, or in some states, conservatorship. I know there's representatives here from every state. So every state has its own guardianship and conservatorship law. But in general, the way they work is this. If a judge decides that a person lacks the ability to exercise a right, or they call it lacks capacity to exercise a certain right, the judge will take that right away from the person and give it to someone else. That someone else becomes the guardian or conservator, depending upon the state you're in. They both essentially do the same thing. So the person loses rights, the other one gets the right. And even though every state, just about every state, I think a couple of them don't have the specific language, say that you should only lose those rights that you cannot exercise, and that guardianship should be targeted only to take away rights people truly can't exercise. What we know from studies is that upwards of 90% of guardianships take away all rights. It's called a full or a plenary guardianship, regardless of the person's abilities, regardless of the person's opportunities, regardless of the person's desire. So think of it that way. When we think of rights, imagine that. Imagine being able to exercise your right, but because you have a diagnosis or a limitation or a label, losing all of them simply because that's the way we've been doing it. As the quote on your screen says, as long as the law allows taking away all rights, courts are going to do it. I know a law professor who says that when you lose all your rights, you become an unperson. Because you can't do anything unless your guardian approves it. You can't vote. You can't go places. You can't do things. You can't get health care. Some places you can't get married unless your guardian approves it. So I would say I'm not here to say there should be no guardians. I have no problem with guardianship and conservatorship. Where I have a concern is when we put overbroad and undue guardianships, where we take away too many rights, or we take away rights from people who don't need to lose their rights. When that happens, what winds up is we have somebody appointed to make decisions for someone else who can make those decisions, him or herself. And when guardians get that kind of power, they have incredible power into the most basic areas of people's lives, into the most intimate medical and physical areas of a person's life. We've seen time and time again guardianships where the guardian simply takes over all decision making. And you know what? We've known, just like we know for 40 years, that self-determination is a good thing and leads to a better life. We also know that when people lose self-determination, when they lose their rights, their lives get worse. We know that people who are denied self-determination can feel helpless, hopeless, and self-critical. The rest of that quote up on your screen is they don't behave because they see no point in behaving. We also have studies that find when people lose their rights and self-determination, they stop trying. They take it as a personal affront, a failure, and stop trying to do other things because they assume they'll fail at that too. That's a phenomenon called learned helplessness. So when I say I am concerned about overbroad and undue guardianship, about using guardianship reflexively, saying this person is vulnerable, therefore this person needs a guardian, or this person is in danger, therefore this person needs a guardian, or this person has made some mistakes and therefore needs a guardian. I worry about that because we have science that says that can be a very bad thing. And we have law that says the same thing. Up on your screen is a quote from Congressman Claude Pepper. That quote is 31 years old now, actually. And Congressman Pepper led the first investigation congressional into guardianship. They looked at guardians, people under guardianship laws, etc. What you're looking at is basically page 1, paragraph 1 of their reports. Look at the dark words. The typical ward, person under guardianship, has fewer rights than the typical convicted felon. When people are under overbroad and undue guardianship, when they lose rights that they could exercise, think about it. You've got a person over them who, like the congressman says, can decide where they go, what they do, who they see, what, if any, medical care they get, and sometimes when they die. As Congressman Pepper said, it is the most punitive civil penalty that can be levied against an American citizen. The rest of that sentence, short of the death penalty. Here's a story about that. On your screen is a picture of two people, DINO and LILLIAN. They were covered in the New York Times not that long ago. DINO told the story. He was a big band leader after World War II. And LILLIAN would come in to dance at his club, and he liked the way she did the tango, and she liked the way he sang. And they courted, his words, fell in love, and got married. And DINO and LILLIAN did everything right. They did everything we tell people to do for estate planning. They were married for 45 years. They did everything together. And as they got older, they developed powers of attorney and advance directives to say if one of us becomes incapacitated, the other should make decisions for that person. Because as DINO said, who better to make decisions for my wife than the person who knows and loves her the most? That's everything we tell people to do. And when LILLIAN was diagnosed with Alzheimer's-related dementia, they worked together to find the best care home for her. And DINO went every day, according to the article, bringing her her favorite foods and singing her her favorite songs. And everything was doing exactly the way it's supposed to go. Until one day when DINO had questions about the bill and mentioned that a new staffer had dropped LILLIAN. And DINO came home one day to find a petition for guardianship on his front door. See, the nursing home had asked for a guardian to be appointed over everything in LILLIAN's life, despite the power of attorney, despite the advance directive. And to have the guardian be given plenary authority, all rights to make all decisions. When asked why, the attorney for the nursing home said that guardianship is a legitimate means to get the nursing home paid. That's what can happen when people lose their rights. So the question is, what do we do about it and where do we go from here? I made you a promise, I'm going to keep it. I'm not here to say there should never be guardians. In fact, there are definitely times when guardianship is needed, and you've seen these occasions. When a person is so disabled, so impaired, that he or she cannot take part in the decision-making process, of course guardianship is right. When a person refuses or does not want to take part, in the decision-making process and is putting him or herself at risk. Guardianship's, of course, appropriate. In an emergency, when there's no one around to provide support, of course, guardianship can be an option. So I'm not here to say there should never be guardianships, but I am here to say there should never be reflexive guardianships. We should never put someone under guardianship just because they have this diagnosis or they're that many years old or they need help, or the two at the bottom, which I hear far too often and which turn my stomach every time, because that's the way it's always been and because it's for their own good. I hear that from parents and from siblings and children of older adults. I need guardianship for their own good. And I always think to myself, for your own good. First of all, if you're like me, if you hear the phrase, relax, it's for your own good, you know something bad's about to happen. You are thinking you're about to get a shot. You are looking for the exit. So there's that. But second of all, consider what I just showed you about the science. We have 40 years of studies saying that losing rights is most assuredly not in a person's best interest, except in very limited situations. And, you know, I doing this as long as I have, I've come to realize that there's almost no villains here. I mean, DINO and LILLIAN story has what I think is a villain, but most of the time someone seeking guardianship is a family member, a parent, a concerned family member, an APS worker who has seen something horrible is recommending guardianship. But that is another thing we have to be careful with, because when we mean well, we have to be really careful. There's a quote up on your screen from the U.S. Supreme Court. It's 90 years old, and it is still appropriate. The court said when we mean well, we have to be the most careful, because the greatest dangers to liberty are when we mean well. We act with well-meaning, with zeal, but we don't think about or understand the consequences. When we say this person needs a guardian just because they have this disability or reflexively or don't consider alternatives, we are undoubtedly meaning well, but the science says we could actually be hurting them. And again, I hear it. You know, I am sympathetic to every person who thinks to protect someone, a guardianship is needed. And I hear the phrases all the time. They might do something they shouldn't do, or meet someone they shouldn't meet, or sign something they shouldn't sign. We have to protect them from themselves, from making mistakes. I always ask people to look in the mirror on that one. Because if you've closed on a mortgage and you're like me, you signed every paper they put in front of you without reading them. You put hundreds of thousands of dollars of your money and 30 years of your life in the hands of a bank without reading every page. Something you shouldn't sign. If you've ever consented to surgery like I have, you've had tons of papers shoved in your face by doctors and nurses and anesthesiologists talking jargon at you, and you just sign them, putting your lives in the hands of strangers. We all need guardians if that's the standard. My God, if anyone like me has had a couple of drinks and gone on Amazon.com, we definitely need guardians, because we have all done things we shouldn't do and signed things we shouldn't sign and bought things we shouldn't bought. But think farther. Think about the mistakes you've made and how they've made you. Think about the bad relationships you've had that taught you what good ones are. Think about times that you had a friend pull you back from the edge, or you were the friend pulling someone back from the edge, or you had an experience where you said, my God, I'm never doing that again. I feel really dumb for having done it, but it taught me something. I'm not going back there. It taught me something about myself. Our mistakes, our bad decisions teach us who we are and who we want to be. That Sartre quote I always lead with, I think he's wrong, actually. We are not our choices. We're our bad choices. Our bad choices, our mistakes shape us and tell us who we are. So when we have a reflexive guardianship to stop someone from making mistakes, for someone's own good, are we really saying that they can't grow? Or they don't get the same chances we do? The same opportunities to experience triumphs as well as mistakes, to fall down and get back up? I mean, another example for you. Today we're sitting here in 2019. Think about 1995. If you were in this field in 95, working with older adults and people with disabilities, the landscape was vastly different in 1995. society was still able to institutionalize people with disabilities regardless of their abilities, regardless of their desires. We could say, you're going to live in an institution. We could put people to work in sheltered workshops, making pennies on the dollar and brag about it. We had placements there. We didn't have technology like we have today. Now think about today. Community integration and employment is a right and an expectation. We have technology that connects people with supporters and helps them manage their medication and healthcare, helps them manage their money, and helps them bring people into their lives to help them do it. We have more ways now to make more people more independent than ever before. And yet the number of people under guardianship has tripled since 1995. At a time when we have a way to make more people more self-determined, and we have laws, like Alan said, that say that very clearly, that we should be emphasizing self-determination, and we have science that says self-determination leads to a better life, 1 million more people have gone under guardianship in just the last 25 years. So why? And before you say it's because the population is aging, while it is, the evidence, anecdotal and specific, says that the fastest growing population going to guardianship are people with disabilities, mostly 18-year-olds, because we meant well, because we were afraid, because we wanted to protect, because we thought that was our only option, because our culture has said that for 1,500 years. Well, the science paints a pretty grim picture of that. We know that people placed in overbroad or undue guardianships who lose their rights when they could exercise them, it can have a significant negative impact on their physical and mental health and their well-being. They feel worse. They live less long. They feel less well. They are less well. But on the other hand, we have study after study that say when people with disabilities and older adults make more choices, they have better lives. Older adults who have more self-determination report a better quality of life, more involvement in their health care, and a better and more willingness to adjust to increasing care needs, to be part of their solutions as well as their plans. People with disabilities who have more self-determination are more likely to have jobs and homes. And providing support, one of my favorite studies on this, is that people with dementia who were found to be unable to consent to treatment, when provided with support, were able to give informed consent and be part of their treatment. They could be independent. The exact things that APS workers are there to ensure, that people are protected and that their rights are protected. And people with disabilities, like I said, we have 40 years of studies proving that. So where can we go from here? It's my hope, this being the why segment, that I've shown you that self-determination is a good thing and why we should be stressing self-determination and why losing it is a bad thing. But what that does not mean as an APS worker or as a human being is that we should be saying to vulnerable adults, you're on your own, go be self-determined. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. Self-determination is not being on your own, because some people need help. In fact, everyone needs help. Just logging on to this webinar, I required a lot of help. We all need help in ways large and small. People with disabilities and older adults might need more help, more intense help, longer help, but help is part of what makes us self-determined. So that is what I'm saying is where we go from here. As APS professionals, as disability-related professionals, as aging professionals, as human beings, what we need to do is ensure that people have the maximum opportunity to have the maximum self-determination while also having the help they need to be self-determined and exercise their rights. And a way forward is why we're here today, supported decision-making. There's a definition of it up on your screen. Please feel free to write it down. There's lots of words there. It sounds very fancy. It says older adults and people with disabilities working with trusted friends and family members to receive the help they need to exercise their rights and avoid guardianships. Like I said, lots of stuff there. My suggestion, and even though I wrote that, and that's the definition you'll see if you Google it and you find a textbook, that I would ignore that definition, because really think about the way you make decisions. Think about the way you get support to make decisions. When the doctor talks jargon, you say, can you please explain that in plain English? When you need advice because you're too close to a decision, you go to a friend and ask for advice on how to handle something. When you have to do your taxes, you have an accountant, or like me, you have TurboTax. That's what supported decision-making is. Supported decision-making is nothing more or less than getting the help you need to do the things you have to do. Finding the people in your life, or finding people for your life who can give you the support. I guarantee everyone on this call exercised some supported decision-making today. We all get advice. We all give advice. In fact, I've grown even loath of the term supported decision-making because it sounds like a separate program instead of part and parcel of every single thing we do in this world. If you made a decision today, there is a very good chance you got support to do it. So that's all supported decision-making is. We just had to put a fancy label on something we do every day to make it clear that people with disabilities and older adults are people too who need support and can exercise support. I mean, think about Lillian's situation. I mean, Lillian was put under guardianship even though she had a power of attorney and advance directive. That guardianship did nothing for her. It literally did nothing that the power of attorney didn't already do. There was already material in place for a decision maker when needed, but that POA allowed for supported decision making with DINO because he knew her and knew what Lillian liked and was going to give her the chance and respect her wishes. Instead, that was taken away. Lillian's rights and her self-determination were stripped. And as we know from science, that leads to a worse life. The alternative, of course, was to work the way they had set it up and use the support. You know, if you work in disabilities like I do, you've heard of a case called the Olmsted decision. It is one of the most famous cases for the rights of people with disabilities. Olmsted said that people with disabilities have a full and equal right to be full and equal members of their communities. In other words, if someone can live in the community, they shouldn't be locked up in an institution if they don't want to be. We shouldn't be able to say it doesn't matter what you want or can do, you're going to be institutionalized. Because as the court found, that unjustified institutional isolation diminishes opportunities, it diminishes life. Because when you're locked away and you're isolated, it's going to make it much harder to do those everyday life activities we take for granted, work and school and medical care and family activities and doing cultural things. All of those become much harder to do when you have no say about whether to stay inside or out. Now, think about what a guardianship that is overbroad or undue can do to a person when someone else has the power to say where you go, what you do, and who you see. Isn't that the same type of isolation? Just like you can't get out of the institution with someone's help. You can't get out and do things without the guardian's okay. That's why we have to be careful. Instead of reflexively seeking guardianship, we must maximize, not just what the law says, not just what the Supreme Court says, not just what the science says. It's the right thing to do. Imagine yourself in Lillian's shoes. Imagine yourself with a plan and a desire to have things your way and have it all stripped away. How would you feel? How would you feel if it was a member of your family? You know, in every law, I didn't pull any of your specific state laws, but they all say a person who lacks capacity is the term, needs a guardian. And most of the state laws out there define capacity by saying the capacity to do things. They use the same word to define the word. But it really comes down to this. Capacity is the ability to understand and make and communicate decisions. But the thing of it is this, with capacity, and you know this already because it's common sense, capacity is not a you have it or you don't issue. Capacity isn't a 100% or zero situation. What you have the capacity to do depends upon your unique experience and, frankly, the help you have. There are some things everyone on this call can do right now without any help. You have the capacity to do them. They're what you're really good at. There are other things you need help at. There are other things you can't do at all without help. I myself am horrible at math and taxes. I could not get my taxes done without the help from TurboTax. Some people, when they get really close to a personal decision, can't make the decision without having talked to somebody first. In fact, we encourage that personally and professionally. We say, don't go off half-cocked. Talk to your colleagues. Don't make a rash decision. So think about that with regard to capacity. Capacity isn't you have it or you don't. Capacity is dependent upon where you are that day. Some days you're more capable than others. And who you have available to you. Capacity is all about support. And capacity fluctuates depending upon the situation. Think about going to the doctor. I'm a huge baby when I go to the doctor. And I say to the doctor, I don't feel well. Please give me a pill. And the doctor signs a script. I kiss the doctor's ring, I take the pill. I had capacity to take the pill, but I have no idea what I just took. I can't spell erythromycin. I don't know the difference between erythromycin and the Z-Pak. I don't know what the side effects or costs and benefits are of both, because I'm not reading that tiny print. I trusted my doctor. I had the support of my doctor. So I had the capacity to take medication, but I don't have the capacity to understand or prescribe it. That doesn't mean I lack the capacity to take care of my health. I have no idea how my car runs. I have a mechanic and a friend who gives me advice. Doesn't mean I'm not allowed to drive. And whether or not I can balance a checkbook anymore, there are programs that help me out with my banking. But if I can't do that, it doesn't mean I can't manage my money. Because when you have support, something that you would otherwise lack capacity to do, you can have capacity to do it. So I urge people to ask themselves these questions when they're considering guardianship. If a person lacks capacity in a vacuum to make a decision, but can do it if they have help or support, do they in fact lack capacity? If your guardianship statute says that if it's in the best interests of a person, guardianship's appropriate. If a person is able to be self-determined and exercise support when they have help, is it in their best interest to be under guardianship? And that means the most important question of all is this one. Before you recommend a guardianship, before you seek a guardianship, you've got to ask a question. What else have you tried? I was in a room full of judges in North Carolina yesterday, and I told them that's incumbent upon all of us to ask that question before we decide that a person lacks capacity. Because we have to ask what was done for that person, what kind of support that person had before we decide they can't do it. A person that you see in a very difficult situation may be in danger, and it may be that person needs protection in the short term. But does it mean the person lacks capacity, needs a guardianship? We have to ask what we've tried, because when we get support, we can do more things and be more protected. There is a study, in fact, that says with people with intellectual disabilities, when they have more self-determination, they're better able to recognize abusive situations. There are multiple studies on the interplay between self-determination and safety. So these things I'm telling you don't exist in a vacuum. It's not just my position. It's the position of the National Guardianship Association, right up on your screen. The National Guardianship Association, if you haven't heard of them, you can find them at guardianship.org. They're made up of guardians, by guardians, and for guardians. They train guardians. They have a code of ethics for guardians. There is no one more invested in guardianship than the NGA. And what they say is that before seeking a guardianship, try something else. Try to empower someone. Try supported decision-making. Try to see if there are opportunities that can empower this person. Why? It might work. And if it works, we know from the science that will lead to a better life. And if it doesn't, hey, then we can say reasonably that capacity was lacking. And supported decision-making is a way we can build that. And it works the same way it does for everyone else, which is to say there is no one way to do it. Anita, I'm sure, will give you some ideas and strategies. But the thing to remember is this. Every person is different. Although I think everyone on this call has probably used supported decision-making today, I'll guarantee you that no two people have used it in the same way. Because there are different support needs in different areas, and the same is true for the people you work with. Some people just might need a friend, a listener. Some people might need a plan. They might need someone to do finances with them or healthcare with them. Other people might need a service plan going through a formal agency to create even things called micro boards and circles of support. The key is this. When I am getting help from you in any way, shape, or form to help me understand, make, and communicate my decisions, I'm engaging in supported decision-making. And the ways that happen differ with the individual. So that's why I call it a paradigm, not a process. Because there's so many different ways we can bring this in together, and that you can do when you are helping a vulnerable adult in a difficult situation. You can get to know that person and find out what his or her needs are, whether they need to be hooked up with a community support agency, whether they need someone to be a power of attorney or a supporter or a specific help in a specific area. Someone might need a very specific support plan done through a state or a state agency. All of these are opportunities for supported decision-making. So what I say about supported decision-making is this. There's three things they have in common at all times. It is one, a recognition that everyone has the right to make choices to the maximum of their ability. And frankly, if you believe in the Declaration of Independence, you already believe in that. Two, I can ask for help in exercising my rights without you assuming that means I can't do it. I can't exercise my rights. And we must believe in that because we ask for help every day in things and expect people not to assume that we're incapable. And three, there's many ways to give and get help as there are people. You may have to go to plan B or plan C or plan D, but we can try things. We can hook people up with agencies to give them the maximum opportunity to be safe, because the science says when you're more self-determined, you're safer, and to be more self-determined before we jump to guardianship. And as I've told you that self-determination is a good thing, I can tell you that the studies are coming in, and they're showing that when people use supported decision-making to make their own decisions instead of having a guardian make decisions for them, they're more self-determined. That's not rocket science either. If I'm making my own decisions, I have more control over my life. But what we know is that self-determination leads to all those quality of life benefits, health and independence and opportunity. So why wouldn't we try it first? I'm not saying there should never be a guardianship, but we should try, and there are opportunities all around us. Think about some of the things that you do and some of the agencies you interact with. Informed consent at a doctor's office is an opportunity for supported decision-making because the doctor has to understand me, I have to understand the doctor. A supporter can help each of them understand each other. Informed choice in vocational programs where and person-centered planning and community programs where a counselor works with me to help me understand my options so I can choose the one that's best for me is just supported decision-making. And there are agencies upon agencies in all of your states. Medicaid waivers and vocational rehabilitation and special education services and centers for independent living and area agencies on aging. There are private organizations like the ARC and NAMI and AARP, all of whom have gotten on board with supported decision-making. So you can always seek someone out to provide or understand the help the person needs. And it's been my pleasure to talk with you today. I'm happy to answer any questions with the couple of minutes I think I have left before I turn it over to Anita. Are there any?
Yes, there was one question that was, in APS, we frequently talk about balancing self-determination with safety. Which studies can you cite that show increased self-determination leads to increased safety?
There are a series of studies done by a professor named Ishita Kemka, Khemka. Dr. Kemka did a lot of studies with women with intellectual disabilities. You probably know this, but I'll tell you already, that women with intellectual disabilities are vastly more likely to be abused, physically, sexually, emotionally. It's actually pretty awful. What Dr. Kemka did in several studies, and my email's up on your screen, please feel free to email me and I can forward you one because I used it in a couple of cases. What Dr. Kemka did in one of her studies was she divided up women with intellectual disabilities of similar abilities and limitations, so apples to apples. The experimental group, she gave them a curriculum designed to increase their self-determination, to make them teach them to make more choices and be more self-determined. The control group got nothing. After she completed the curriculum, both groups received a test on the ability to recognize abusive situations, again, a recognized test. And the ones with more self-determinations were found to be better able to recognize potentially abusive situations and able to avoid abuse. To me, that's the definition of safety, isn't it? If we can look at the ability to recognize abuse, and again, Dr. Kemka's study is not rocket science. Aren't you more possessive and more protective of the things you know are yours? If you know it's your body and it's your life and it's your money, you're going to be more likely to protect it. So when we talk about vulnerable adults, I tell judges across the country, it makes no sense to say comply and take away rights. Those are the people least likely to put up a squawk when an abuser is there. And guardianship, I'll end with this. If you think about guardianship as a protective device, it's not a suit of armor, because the guardian is not with the person 24/7. And at some point, that person is going to encounter someone else. And what we should be doing is empowering that person to be aware and self-determined and protective of their own self, because a guardian cannot stop interaction with other people. It doesn't work that way. I mean, think about Rapunzel, the ultimate guardianship situation. She got out. People are going to have the opportunity to be abused, neglected, or exploited. What we need to do is empower them to recognize it and protect themselves from it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anita. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll wait for, okay, I am now going to do my part in bringing my screen to life. Okay, I think we're there. So thank you. Thank you for that super engaging and informative introduction and theory about supported decision-making, Jonathan. And I want to talk now a little bit more about delving into the practical aspect. Before we do that, I do want to spend a little more time. I appreciate the introductory comments from Alan about NAPSA's Code of Ethics. I really want to hit this hard because I recognize all of us are coming from different levels of experience and comfort with supported decision-making, and also work in arenas where we may encounter resistance. Change is hard. This is culture change. Culture change can take decades. And so I want to give people some of the background to take back to your work settings as well. Turning to our own code of ethics, Adult Protective Services is not simply promoting safety. And I think for a lot of us, and I think expectations from community members and our colleagues often is that it's about promoting safety. But turn to our code of ethics. It also is about promoting that independence and that quality of life for people who are being or at risk of being maltreated. The guiding value says it all, finding that, and it can be a delicate balance between protecting the safety of the vulnerable adult, the individual living in that precarious situation, with their right to decide what happens in their lives, their right to determine what's important to them, that they, yes, have the right to be safe. That's why APS exists. Balanced with, they also have the right to retain all of their constitutional rights, living how they want, spending their money in ways that are important to them, which we may not agree with, entering into contracts. All of these rights, despite being in a status of a vulnerable adult, being a vulnerable adult who's maltreated, legally, they have the right to continue making those decisions, good, bad, or otherwise, unless the court has removed those rights via a guardianship. Recognizing, too, people make decisions differently than we do. Have to recognize somebody's own choices and own values, which inform their decisions, may be very different than ours, very different from societal norms, that our people we're serving have the right to accept or refuse services. Restating, this is just so valuable to take back to your environment. The interests of the adult are first. We don't put our own values on them. We recognize that people are making decisions from a lifetime, in many cases, based on a lifetime of their own culture, their own personal values. And that while they have the right, and we want to protect their right to make information, we at the same time, we have a responsibility, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next few slides. We have a responsibility, too, to bring them the information about the choices and options and consequences of their decision in ways that they can understand, which has incredible relevance based on educational level, intellectual sophistication, their ability to read, speak, understand our language. I really love these practice guidelines that talk about our focus being on maximizing the person's independence. Independence, I think that word's a little loaded. I think that we should update our thinking about independence, right? Independence to many of us simply means all by myself. Of course, interdependence is probably a more accurate term. Maximizing their interdependence and choice based on their capacity. Start with the least restrictive services. Our guardianship laws all respect that as well. We turn to family and informal support. The APS guidelines were written quite a few years ago and already incorporated, maybe without even knowing it, already are incorporating the benefits and the values about supported decision-making in supporting an individual as long as it's in their best interest. Value for recognizing substituted judgment, that notion of what decision do they want to make, and even if they are currently unable to make that decision themselves, what decision would the person make, knowing their own life history, and building a safety and protection plan around substituted judgment when we know what the vulnerable adult's values are. And the final one is exactly what Jonathan has been talking about this first half of our time today. Guardianship really can be a very harmful intervention, and we ought to be very careful and recognizing that inappropriate intervention certainly can be worse than none at all. I think that's an interesting concept that NAPSA made a point of including in the practice guidelines, and I'd like us really to store that in our brains when we're contemplating what sort of intervention is the best for in an individual situation, regardless of the level of harm and the level of incapacity. Another way of looking at that, one of my favorite authors, my favorite physician, Atul Gawande, if you haven't read his book, any number of his books, but particularly Being Mortal, this section in his book really resonated with me and in the APS world that we work in. Our most cruel failure in how we treat people when we're intervening to protect someone, we forget, we aren't recognizing that the people we're serving have priorities perhaps far different than our APS need to help shape safety and protection. That sometimes the ability to remain in charge, not sometimes, always, the ability to remain in charge or have a significant say in one's own story, one's own life, one's own choices is far more important in many situations to many people, if not most and all, than simply being safe and living longer. So it really is time. This is a culture change. Again, to reiterate Jonathan's earlier point, no one is saying, and I hear people talk about that. I hear people talk about supported decision making. There's people out there who want guardianship to go away. No, that's not the case. There is a place for guardianship. Absolutely. I can tell many stories. You all can as well. Positive stories of how somebody's goals were honored and protected, and their desires met, their ability to remain in the living environment of their choice because of the existence of a guardian and a guardianship. We need it, but what we must change is that default that we have nationwide. Here in Minnesota, it's the same. We tend to have a value of defaulting to guardianship simply because of vulnerabilities or because of choices that a person has made or choices that they aren't able to make all by themselves. Constantly being aware of that balance between understanding and promoting the benefits of self-determination and trying to avoid the harm that can come with guardianship. Jonathan hit it already. One of the benefits of going second in a webinar is you get to keep saying, I don't have to go over these parts. It's been well covered. We all have the right to make choices, and don't we all want those rights to remain and to be protected? Critically, just because someone needs help, just because someone isn't capable of understanding their situation, they're not capable of taking their medicines by themselves, of arranging their own housing. I hear those as excuses. That's why we need guardianship. The supported decision making is all well and good, but they can't, in the final analysis, they can't arrange their own housing. Who among us can? Mortgages are complicated. Medical assistance is complicated. Waivers, this is all very complicated. We all need help. That doesn't mean we have to have a guardian. A lot of professionals we work with have a real hard time with this concept. There's a lot more comfort with the clear delineation of legal authority. Guardians have power. We know who to turn to. We can cut through the jargon faster, it's easier, it's clean and neat and tidy, it's black and white. But that's just not the reality. We have to have some comfort with some ambiguity. We have to have these values of helping support a person, sometimes without having that clear delineation, because that is the right thing to do. That's the ethical, that's the legal thing we need to do. We must confront our own assumptions. Alan, I'm a little embarrassed. I'm not embarrassed. Let's embrace proudly our experience in our years. 30 years, Alan mentioned, I've been doing this work, and I will tell you, personally, my approaches have changed. My approaches have changed. I have evolved in looking at a person with a dementia, with a significant intellectual or developmental disability and that assumption that that means they must have a decision maker. We have to change that approach and recognize that many, not all, but many people can, with support and assistance of family, of professionals, of case managers, health systems, can in fact assist an individual to achieve safety, to have that balance with their own choices, but without having that guardian legal decision maker. This is really scary too, especially in the APS world, because we see a lot of pretty challenged. I'm struggling with the word because I don't like the word dysfunctional families. I think that is an easy excuse to then discount them and discredit them. We see a lot of family situations where families are really challenged and may not have the skills or desires that we wish they had to play a positive and significant role. But really, sometimes that is more about our own assumptions, about our own biases. We want to recognize risk factors about families stepping in and playing a significant role in supporting an individual, and sort out where is our bias versus our reality, the reality of whether family can, maybe with some support, some education, building in some extra protections, how can they continue to play a positive role even where they previously have perhaps had a negative. This is coming down to confronting our own risk tolerance and that of other professions. Sometimes we as social workers have a higher comfort level with a little bit of risk and supporting a little bit of risk, or more than a little, with our clients than maybe our physician colleagues or our nurse colleagues. So we may need to confront people. And as we're doing that, how do we do that? How do we serve individuals, getting into the practical aspects of supporting them is what I call good social work. And we don't have to all be good social workers, but in the social services world, whatever our actual title and degree, is that joining with the person, building trust with them, demonstrating to them that we're here to be of support to them. We're helping advocate to others that they be allowed to make the decisions they can make. We're really advocating and ensuring ourselves in our interactions with people that we are accommodating for their disabilities. Are we ensuring, before we're making decisions about a person's need for a legal guardian, are we ensuring that we have obtained the hearing aids they need, the cleaning the wax out of the ears, the cleaning those smudged, icky glasses that impact a person's ability to see the forms we're asking them? Are they hearing us? Are we speaking in their language? Are we speaking in plain language? Are our forms in plain language? We have a significant responsibility to accommodate for the deficits or the disabilities of the people we're serving so that they can be in the best place to be able to make decisions, helping them understand they have the right. And that's about building trust too. When they understand, we're sharing with them, yeah, you do have the right to say no, you do have the right to decline these services, but here's how, if you do decline these services, or if you send me away and I can't help you anymore, what we call facilitating realistic goal setting, or sort of being an insight proxy for someone who might lack the intrinsic ability to have that insight, helping them understand it's not just taking their no for an answer. They refuse services, they refuse to accept, they refused my help. See ya, going away, closed case. That would be neglectful in the role we're playing. Instead, working with them with that trusting relationship, helping them identify what's going on, what resources are available, what services can we connect them with so that they have their needs met, their safety concerns addressed, but also in such a way that they're involved, they're making the decision and practicing and benefiting from all of the pieces that come with the benefits of self-determination, connecting them with resources. Ultimately, the decisions we're making, the choices we're making in providing services or balancing, building a service and protection plan must be about weighing that risk of the harm that'll come to the person with the impacts that our protections, that we've determined our protections that they quote, need, the harm that comes with that loss of self-determination. We must ensure that the benefit of protection of a guardianship, for example, does indeed outweigh the losses to the person as they lose their self-determination. Moving from that, you must have to, let's talk about what is going on, the old what else have we tried opportunity, changing our approaches with individuals from telling them what they must have to coaching. Again, I certainly suspect I'm not telling any of you things you don't already know, hoping that framing this argument or framing these concepts are helpful to you in your work and also helpful to take back to your work settings. Bottom line, we certainly in no way are advocating that we're simply abandoning a person to their choice, but we're also trying to get away from that idea of that primary ultimate focus on risk elimination, or as I call bubble wrapping the person. It's just simply, a little overstatement there, but it is just simply balancing that self-determination, the patients, the persons, the individual we're serving, their desires with the needs for safety and protection. That's what person-centered services are about. Recognizing and in working, building that trusting relationship, advocating for the person, those things that are important to them, how they spend their time, who they're in relationships with, where they live among the available choices, how they, whether they work or not work, voc rehab versus in the private pay market, who their providers are, clothing, tattoos, hairstyles. These are the things that are important to the person, and a skilled worker is going to be able to join with that individual in recognizing and understanding and learning what's important to them in order to leverage the desire to have the tools in order to provide for, get connected with care, services, and supports that are in the for column. What's important for them, those health needs, those safety needs, policy and law compliance, balancing. That's what person-centered interventions are all about, is really this formula of leveraging what's important to the person and getting to ensure that we've got the health and safety, recognizing again, our values, our definition of health and safety may not be the same as the individual's. We have a lot of tools that we can turn to when it comes to healthcare decision making. The healthcare, in my state, it's called a healthcare directive, healthcare power of attorney, medical power of attorney for healthcare, whatever it's called in your state. This is a beautiful tool, and this is a tool that is often forgotten because, or often set aside, thinking this person is too incapacitated to complete a healthcare directive. In my state, and I suspect in many of yours, we have two levels of decision making with regard to establishing a healthcare directive. One is that ability that we need, that ability to declare our wishes. Should I not be able to speak for myself? I want, or my values dictate that I have these kinds of medical interventions or not those kinds. I value consciousness over pain mitigation. If I'm in at end of life and these kinds of conditions are in existence, I would rather have comfort measures than aggressive curative treatment. Those are complicated levels of medical decision making that maybe many of us aren't capable of doing, but it's a much lower legal bar to say, I may not know how to make that medical decision, but I do know I want my sister involved in it. And in Minnesota, that's enough legal capacity to complete a healthcare directive naming my sister as my healthcare agent, who can then be involved. That's supported decision making with wrapping around a formal tool. We often forget about another basic tool, the release of information. Families can be involved. Families often get told, you must go seek guardianship because your person can no longer consent, your person can no longer make their own decisions, and the doctors won't talk to you anymore, so go get guardianship. Well, again, similar to the levels of capacity required for a healthcare directive, similarly, a person may not understand their whole complex medical situation, but be completely capable of saying, yep, talk to my mom, talk to my son. I want those people involved in my life. That's enough basis to sign a release of information. Professional standards and ethics dictate. Many of you, there are some 30 states to my knowledge who have surrogacy consent laws that allow providers, and for those of us in states who don't have those laws, medical ethics, the American Medical Association, health system institutions often have written policies that say if we are presented with a patient who we don't believe is capable of making the medical decision, we can, depending on the law and policy, we can turn to family members. We can turn to, in some states, 2 other physicians to make a decision. We don't have to turn to guardianship. The value and benefits, we've been talking over and over today about the value and benefit of family, to be able to be involved. And by the way, professionals can be supporters in supported decision-making arrangements as well. There's a lot of talk on supported decision-making listservs, and amongst all of us, there's a lot of talk about this potentially being a conflict of interest. And it is a conflict of interest, particularly if supporters are making decisions for the individual. But if they're doing that, that's not supported decision-making, is it? Supporters, be they family or professionals, that is our role as supporters, is to bring the information, translate it in ways the person can understand, help them, as we talked about earlier, facilitating realistic goal setting, helping them understand the consequences of decisions, bringing the information so they're making the best decision for themselves. No conflict there. The person's making their decision. And then, of course, we can also formalize it. If you're in a state who has legislated supported decision-making agreements, great. Lots of resources out there. Even for those of us in states who have not legislated that, there is, I would wager, I know in Minnesota, there's nothing in our statute that says we can't use that. In fact, it is part of the ADA, the AOA, Patient Self-Determination Act. Individuals can say, I want so-and-so involved when we're sitting down talking about these issues. And can they put that in writing? Nothing in our law says they can't. So we can use supported decision-making agreements to assist in healthcare decision-making and other decisions, even if it's not legislatively defined in our state's laws. With regard to care and residential, same concepts. We get supporters, whether it's family or in this case, professionals, county case managers through waiver services, private pay, geriatric care managers, our Aging Life Care Association defines care management. There's this whole profession out there of paid care managers who can also assist in bringing the information, opening doors, removing barriers, connecting the person with those community and residential services. A person doesn't have to be capacitated, changing that definition in our mind of capacity. Don't have to figure it out all by themselves. We bring them the information so they can make the decision. Lots of times if we can control the purse strings, sometimes if we have simply a guardian of the estate, or a conservator as it's called in Minnesota, or an attorney in fact appointed under a POA, a trustee, a representative payee, sometimes a combination of bringing the services to the individual and having someone who maybe is needed as a fiduciary to manage the pocketbook, the payments. That can be putting those patching that quilt together of services to get the person the care and residential decisions that need to be made outside of guardianship. Similarly with making financial decisions, same thing, building in the tools, helping the person budgeting, banking tools, budgeting, helping person understand consequences. If you spend all of your personal needs money on this, then you don't get to go to the Twins game next week with the rest of the group that's going. Building those skills to understand the consequences and understand budgeting, having those fiduciary tools when necessary to maybe protect larger assets while we're helping the person gain skills to manage maybe safer amounts of personal spending money and so forth, building those skills in. We get so caught up in, but this person's vulnerable, this person has this diagnosis, they might make a bad decision. Unfortunately, there's a lot of attorneys out there, there's a lot of APS workers out there who view guardianship as a protective, a future, a proactive tool. Somebody might make a bad decision. Someone might take advantage of them. We better get guardianship. But again, as Jonathan already hit on earlier, we all make bad decisions. And frankly, I mean, I can list a few here, but you don't want to know that much about me. But I've made decisions that then I learned from. Maybe I made a similar decision a second time or a third time, but don't we learn from our decisions? And when we wrap someone in the bubble wrap of a guardianship or other form of protection, it doesn't mean we can't continue helping them learn how to respond and budget and make better decisions and recognize danger, but too often what happens is we sort of cloak them in the protectiveness of the guardianship, and then we sort of forget about continuing to build skills. Let's not go down that guardianship road. Let's instead help the person learn skills and tools to recognize and avoid bad decisions, bad choices, danger zones, and learn when they do make a bad choice. Again, guardianship is still necessary for some people despite all our best efforts, our most skilled interventions, our best endeavors to approach, to advocate for their rights, facilitate trying to trust and facilitate insight proxies. Sometimes for a good number of people, that's just not going to work. We can't get past a person's inability to recognize their disease process, their diagnosis is such that they don't have the self-awareness. We can't overcome that resistiveness. They're continuing to sabotage all of our efforts to try to promote self-determination, try to promote and make decisions that honor their wishes. We can't get past the fact that some people don't have trusted supporters, or the supporters that are in their lives are, despite our efforts to train, to work with them, to support them, sometimes they just don't have the skills and abilities, or unfortunately the interest in acting in a supportive way for the person. So there are some people for whom guardianship is always going to be necessary. We don't deny that. We definitely recognize it. And in those cases, we want to put in place the most person-centered guardianships that we can. And when we must, even if all of our best efforts to promote and enhance self-determination fail, we do still have protections that we can then turn to. And in fact, the legal recourse we may have to take on later on, those petitions, those arguments will be strengthened by all of the things we have tried outside of guardianship first. We can turn to an emergency guardianship if all of the conditions warrant that level. We can use just a conservatorship or just a guardianship of the estate. As I said earlier, sometimes just controlling the money and the person retains ability to make their own personal residential medical decisions with support of others is sufficient. We can turn to limited. We ought to be turning to limited guardianship, whether it's most common, limited in scope, determine which areas, one or a couple of the statutorily defined powers that may be granted to the guardian by the court. Let's not automatically turn to plenary guardianships every time. A newer movement is let's limit the duration of guardianships. Our statute in Minnesota implies that a guardianship is basically forever until someone goes back, takes an affirmative action to terminate, or the person dies, or there needs to be a successor. But other than that, it just goes on forever. There's nothing in our statute, however, and I have checked this out with my attorney colleagues. In fact, my attorney colleagues, some of them are the ones who sort of birthed some of these ideas, that there's nothing to stop us from asking for a guardianship for, perhaps it's that 18-year-old who has intellectual disability, still needs some more help, some more assistance. Again, hopefully we can still do that outside of guardianship, but when we must, perhaps a 5-6 year guardianship that automatically terminates unless someone takes affirmative action to extend it after that, during that 5-6 year period. That's possible to do even if our statutes don't specifically define that. We can use orders for protection when we're having to deal with maltreatment, people abusing, people financially exploiting. We can use legal tools. We can utilize the tools available to us in our states, orders for protection, banking tools to freeze assets. With great care. Sometimes the only way to unfreeze assets then is to go into court, so we must be careful with those. But we do have those protective tools, and then also ultimately, finally, if we must, we still have the availability of guardianship. We've provided you lots of resources. I want to make sure and call those out, and then I will pause and turn it back over so we can do some questions questions with our last little bit left. Jonathan already mentioned the NRC on supported decision-making. Spend a couple hours there. There are a lot of decision-making brainstorming guides. There are suggested agreements. Some of the states who already have legislated supported decision-making agreements, their forms are on there. It's an excellent resource to dig deeper. Newly published book on supported decision-making, tools galore. Spend some time digging around the practical tool from the American Bar Association is a great opportunity to help assess and rule out guardianship, right-sized guardianships. I mentioned the brainstorming guide, how to make supported decision-making agreements. A lot of different tools are out there. We've given you just a few of the resources. Couple webinars, or excuse me, a couple short videos that I like to show people. I do like to point out the Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. This is one that's acceptable to get your friends and spouses to sit down and talk about these concepts with you in a very entertaining way. Don't watch it at work with the volume on because it is late night with John Oliver, or Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, and there's lots of Effenheimers there. So be careful where you watch it, but that's a really fun and sobering take on the problems of guardianship. With that, I will pause and let's see if we've got questions.
So this is Lori Della Grammaticus. I'm the Executive Director of NAPSA, and I've been trying to moderate the questions as they came in. We've got lots of them. The first one is, will the slides be available? And they certainly will be, and we'll get them posted. And at least one person said, this is the best webinar ever. So I wanted to make sure you heard that before we move on. First question, can a client sign to receive supported services when a physician has determined the client does not have capacity to make any decisions and no guardian has been appointed and no legal family representative is involved or available? If so, what resources can be referred for this?
So this is the tension between a physician's determination of medical incapacity versus if a court has not granted a guardianship legally, the person retains the right to sign legal documents. And I would like Jonathan to weigh in on that as well. But legally, the person retains the right. It is definitely the tension when the physician says, no, they're incapacitated. Some of the pushback I guess I would recommend, some of the advocacy I would recommend is, in an evaluation of a person's incapacity, was that about an incapacity to make a medical decision, or was that about an incapacity to make a particular, very specific decision, such as identifying and appointing an agent?
Yeah, Anita's got it exactly right. She has it right on the law, unless a person has been found unable to make decisions by court and a guardian's been appointed, that person retains all of his or her legal rights. But I really want to echo what she said about the doctor's certifications, because this is a real tension in this area, especially when it comes to guardianship. We see a lot of physician certifications, or just a quick affidavit or a quick note saying, I'm the doctor, I don't think this person can make decisions. And I just did 3 days of training in Tennessee for healthcare workers. And I said, when you sign that document, are you doing it with the same, would you say those things in court under oath? And they all kind of shake their heads, because what are you basing this analysis on? We see lots of GPs or specialists who have no discernible training in disability issues or aging issues, simply saying, I'm a doctor and therefore I'm making a finding to a reasonable degree of medical certainty that this person lacks capacity. So I always say, what are you basing this on? I think that's a legitimate question to ask. What training have you had in making these assertions? What training have you had in supported decision making? I write powers of attorney. And that's one of the things I put in, is that any doctor finding this person is incapacitated must also consider supported decision-making. Because I think what we have, again, I speak this as a cultural norm, is that, and I think in the medical field as well, we simply assume that a person with limitations can't do things. And my first question is, how do you know? What have you tried? Or you see, doctors, especially when they're seeing people who are unwell, are seeing them at their worst. There have been times when I would say I lack capacity to make decisions because I've been so sick. So I wonder what this stuff is based on. And in the case that I was, became known for, the doctor, the psychologist it was, who found the person incapacitated, found that based upon an assessment that she did while my client was on Percocet. So you have to ask those questions. Where did it come from? So that's the biggest resource I can ask you, is ask. As I told judges yesterday, you wouldn't just take someone's word for it in a custody case. You wouldn't just take someone's word for it in a criminal case. You would say, what is this based upon? Why aren't we doing that here?
Excellent. Thank you. The next question is, often there are not many resources to help assist our intellectual individuals. I think he means with limited intellectual ability. What do we do then?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Often there are not many resources to help assist our intellectual individuals. What do we do then?
There's actually lots of resources around unsupported decision-making for people with intellectual disabilities. I would suggest starting at supporteddecisionmaking.org. Anita mentioned a bunch of them, including the brainstorming guide. There's one that I particularly like, it's not just because I co-wrote it, called Setting the Wheels in Motion, that is aimed at working with people with intellectual disabilities. It's from the point of view of a parent and her kids, but what it has is worksheets. It has questions you can ask and things you can work through. If you Google the Missouri stoplight tool, you will find an assessment that you can do on decision making. If you Google ACLU supported decision making, you'll find a lot of resources, including ones that are directed at people with intellectual disabilities on how to do these skills assessments and create supported decision making agreements. So in sum, first place to start, in my opinion, is supporteddecisionmaking.org, but you have both Anita and my email. I'm always happy to respond to questions.
Definitely. And then maybe if the questioner had more specifics, were they thinking more community resources? We're certainly willing to refine those answers as well.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the next question, and maybe we'll hear more from them. What are your thoughts on APS moving forward with investigation if a person with capacity does not consent? Our state has long held that we cease an investigation in this scenario, but there is a move to change this practice and proceed with the investigation when the alleged victim is not in support.
It's a good policy question for APS. Certainly don't want to be in a position of advising in general opinions. I guess if I can answer a slightly different question, as I mentioned earlier, let's not simply stop with the refusal. Critical questions, getting to, if we have the benefit of that trusting relationship, the space that we can have that conversation, getting at the why. Any refusal of services, refusal of APS involvement in investigation and attempts to build protective plans, because of course that's equally important to simply an investigation, is helping build in the supports for the person. But with the person getting to the why, that's why just sort of like not taking that no for an answer. The person said no, so we're out of here. What's going on with that refusal? Is the person feeling, are we communicating with them in a safe space where it's safe to say, to describe more about why they don't want to go forward? Is this based on fears? Is this based on previous experience? Is this based on general concerns about the intervention of the government? So trying to get more to the why might help us get more to the next steps in being able to support them, which is not exactly a question.
I'll echo Anita entirely, as well as the caveat that the law is the law. But I think the decision of whether or not to consent to an investigation is also one that can be made with support. I think Anita said that very well. Is this person being unduly influenced by someone? Does this person need a different kind of support or Those are things that you can consider to make sure that the person's decision is truly that person's preference.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'm glad you touched on the undue influence piece, because that's always a question. Is the supported person who's helping with the decision actually an undue influencer? Could potentially be an issue. So I'm glad you brought that up.
I want to speak to. Can I speak to that really quick?
Oh. Sure.
Because we see it on bad advice given from someone in a person's life. But we have to make a really critical review of that standard, because there's a difference between making bad decisions because our friends get us to do stupid things and being truly put in a position of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. To put it another way, if we're going to say that we can only make decisions on our own or with support, if we only make good ones, then we all need to look in a mirror. This is not a 100% or zero situation. Abuse, neglect, or exploitation are horrible, and if a supporter is doing that, action should be taken. Bad advice, bad decisions in our lives, these things happen and people face the consequences. We have to make a distinction there. Because if we're only saying you can only make good decisions and only get good advice, I can't play poker with my friends anymore. Or I can't spend last week in New Orleans with my friends because I did some ridiculous things that they're urging. And we all have. So we have to be careful on that standard, because of everyone in our life is influencive. The question is whether that influence crosses the line to abusive, neglectful, or exploitative. People have the right to make stupid decisions. People have the right to do dumb things. People don't have the right to abuse or neglect. I think we have to look for that before we write off the idea.
I think we also can't deny that guardianship itself is not the protective measure we think it is. And you hit on that earlier, Jonathan. Any number of abuses have happened within guardianships, sometimes by guardians. Having that protection of the court is often a false sense of security. As Jonathan said, the guardian's not there 24/7. Sometimes the guardian is the bad guy, and the court is definitely not there 24/7. If we're super fortunate, the court has the staff and the ability to review, think about it, annual reports, what happens the rest of the year.
Yeah, there's never been a study, not a single study, that found that people are inherently safer or have better lives under guardianship. So I always say, if we've got and as Anita pointed out, there have been horrific reports of abuse by guardians. Not to say that guardianship is bad, but to say that some people are awful. So if there is the opportunity to be abused or neglected in anywhere in life, where I'm going to at least start is to empower people to be more self-determined, because we know we have studies that that's correlated with enhanced self-determination and safety. That's at least where I'm going to start, and that's where I'm going to err on the side of.
All right. I have one last question. I think this is all we can fit in. You talked about limiting guardianships. How many states do so? North Dakota put a 5-year limit on all guardianships in 2015. What do other states do for a limit?
Well, first of all, guardianships can be limited not only in time, but in subject matter, and should be limited in subject matter. I said before that 90% of guardianships per one study are full or plenary, when the vast majority of state laws are really clear that guardianship should be limited to only where people can't truly make decisions. And that's just going to be written in your law. So we can limit guardianship that way. I don't speak ill of guardianship because my sister is my godson's guardian, and thank God for it. She's the guardian over his money. He has intellectual disabilities. He can't manage money. He does everything else. Because she handles his money, he can have a really good, independent, self-determined life. So that's an example of a limitation. But with regard to limiting guardianship in scope, any judge can do that. Any judge can put a sunset provision on a guardianship. They're doing that in Vermont. The public guardian saying guardianships end in X years unless there is clear and convincing evidence that needs to be continued. And anyone can ask a judge to do that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for a really, I have to tell you, we have wonderful comments in the question box about how great this is. I need to turn this over to Andy for the last word, and take away, Andy.
Well, I think it's Alan. I'll pick it up.
Alan, it's yours.
Okay. Well, again, thank you, Jonathan and Anita, for your excellent presentations. I mean, your knowledge on the topic and your passion for the topic are really come through very clearly. I want to thank you very much. I want to remind everybody that attendees will receive an email notification once the recorded presentation and the PowerPoint are posted online. So this concludes today's webinar. I'm Alan Lawlitz on behalf of NAPSA and APS TARC. Thank you for participating today. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.